morning and welcome back to the lecture series on tribal studies in India, interdisciplinary approaches and perspectives. So, today we are going to discuss globalization and tribes in India. First, we need to understand what is globalization. In its fundamental sense, globalization constitutes a process of transforming the regional or local phenomena into global ones. This multidimensional phenomenon called globalization exerts a substantial impact both directly and indirectly on all facets of human life across the globe. According to scholar and critic Rahul Kabiraj, the process of lifestyle transformation within any community, regardless of a location or social level, is a result of the integrated action of economic, technological, socio-cultural and political forces, and all these together amount to globalization, the process or the wave called globalization. Now, globalization that is often equated with modernization entails advancement of science and technology and the development of communication infrastructure which mutually interconnect diverse locales and contribute to heightened human mobility. So, when we talk of globalization, we think of a globe that has become smaller and more interconnected through better human mobility, better transportation and quick transportation not only of humans, but also of technology, of information. Everything moves very fast, very soon, and so the profound impact of globalization of culture is especially evident in the indigenous cultures. When talking about the tribal society, what globalization does, in the trails of globalization, what changes, what faces the brunt of globalization is the indigenous culture. Their cultural fabric, the basis of their culture kind of unsettles as a result of globalization. So, because as I have been telling in my previous lectures also, the way globalization envisions a society, envisions the globe is very different from the way the indigenous cultures or tribal societies work. The tribal societies work based on diversity, based on differences, acknowledgement and preservation of these differences, whereas globalization, it has been supposed, it has been apprehended, has a tendency, albeit all its advantages, it has the tendency to bulldoze off, to flatten all the differences and make everything into an an imitation of the West, into an offshoot, an artifact that is produced in the Western powerhouse. So, that becomes very problematic. That is not something that fits very well organically with the tribal social values. So, as the indigenous settlers, the tribal communities have largely inhabited the ecologically distinct and often resource rich environments like the forests and hills, where their lifestyles are deeply conditioned by the natural surroundings. India's substantial ethnic diversity, comprising 8.6% of tribal population according to the 2011 census, with its varied linguistic, economic and socio-cultural fabric, presents a very complex context for understanding the transformative effects of globalization on its diverse tribal cultures. So, globalization has had manifold impacts, different kinds of impacts, different kinds of influences on these very distinct tribal societies, and these societies have in turn responded very differently to the waves of globalization. Navdeep Kaur writes that while globalization is viewed by many as a catalyst for cultural diversification, offering stimulating and often empowering experiences, a significant segment of the tribal population also perceives globalization as something that is disquieting and disempowering. In fact, such intrusions might undo, might completely change the basis of the tribal cultures. So, these sections anxieties, some of these tribal sections anxieties centering globalization is based on its potential for national fragmentation and the loss of established values which are attributed to increasing immigration patterns, the expansive reach of international trade and the pervasive influence of modern communication media that can supplant the local cultural expressions, right. So, this anxiety is not only rooted to some sections of tribal people or tribal rights activists, but it extends even among the non-tribal population. The fact that globalization can undo their existing culture, it can leave very deep wounds, very deep negative aftermaths and consequences in its trail, right. Further, some analysts project a negative future scenario that is characterized by cultural homogenization, with diverse national cultures being overtaken by one global culture that is dominated by Western norms and symbolic systems. So, globalization is exerting a profound influence on tribal communities, resulting in these different groups extensive marginalization within India, and it therefore leaves a negative outcome for the human civilization. The life, livelihood, culture and natural habitat of the indigenous peoples have been intensely and very negatively affected by globalization, and such changes are often justified under the premise of or in the name of development. Scholar and critic Jagannath Pati notes that the remoteness and limited quality of territorial resources have historically been common features of many tribal communities. Previously, the exploitation of these regions would often be restricted to logistical and economic factors. So, when we talk of the earlier times, we are referring to mainly to the colonial and then the post-colonial times, where exploitation of the tribal lands would be mainly in economic terms. However, the current era is marked by rapid technological progress and unparalleled economic and political dominance of global capitalism, alongside the growing influence of neo-colonial mechanisms which operate through the G8 and international financial institutions such as the International Monetary Fund or IMF and the World Bank. A lot of resources are being outsourced. So, when globalization, the waves of globalization, the impacts of globalization rides on money. So, when money from outside the country flows into this region, these tribal regions, it no longer remains only a post-colonial factor. The different national governmental schemes that are interacting with the tribal world system, it is no longer the nation as a category, it becomes transnational, it goes beyond the ambit of the nation. When money from IMF and World Bank flows into these lands for making development, and there is this economic and political dominance of global capitalism, the local culture as a result is completely changed, it is disrupted, and in many times it is destroyed. So, these developments triggered, stimulated by globalization, have created an enabling environment for the encroachment upon and extraction of natural resources from the ecologically vulnerable territories of the tribal peoples. As a result, the forced displacement of tribal populations in order to facilitate massive capital intensive development initiatives has become a distressing and increasingly prevalent occurrence, right. It is no longer the colonial apparatus or even the post colonial bodies displacing the tribal people for capital intensive development, although we can very safely say that the British colonizers and their colonial mechanisms have shown the path to the rest of the world how to exploit these vulnerable people. And now the larger transnational bodies who can invest a lot of money, a lot of capital into these lands are following suit. It is just an aftermath of colonization. It is more intensified, a more amplified avatar of colonization that we see perpetrating on these lands with the phenomenon called globalization. So, the Central Indian tribal belt extending from Gujarat in the west to Assam in the east and encompassing the states of Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand exhibits a significant concentration of industrial and mining activities. This region, characterized by high levels of poverty and a predominantly rural tribal population, over 90% of people are tribes over here, they are tribal people who are engaged in primitive agricultural practices, and these regions incidentally also host major industrial complexes including the steel plants, Bharat Aluminium Company Limited or BALCO, National Aluminium Company Limited or NALCO, and heavy engineering concerns. So, a tribal region, a place which is considered as organic habitat for 90% of tribal population, 90% of this population is tribal, residing in the Central Indian tribal belt between Assam and Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand. So, this is also used as a concentration of mining activities and industrial enterprises. Furthermore, a substantial number of river basin development schemes, hydropower projects and a network of forest based and ancillary industries are also located within this central belt. In this regard, Professor Ram Dayal Munda has asserted that the displacement of India's Adivasi population has reached a critical scale, an alarming scale, with approximately 1/5 of the population, around 2 million tribal individuals already relocated to the slum settlements in metropolitan areas. The quality of life vastly changes. From being a self-sustaining, a self-sufficient people who have been living with considerable dignity in their organic habitat, they have to live in the slum areas of metropolitan cities, cohabiting perhaps with delinquents, with antisocial, with minor, people who are engaged in minor criminal activities. So, the shady areas of city life are inhabited by the same tribals who have previously been very simple, benign peasants. They comprise the peasantry section of our society. So, from there they have to become slum dwellers. The quality, the meaning of life suddenly changes. This is not a theoretical apprehension, but an existent reality in India, and it echoes with other global contexts, notably South America and Southeast Asia, where this process of displacement of the tribals has been fully and completely realized. The displacement has been complete and absolute in places like South America and Southeast Asia, and it is ongoing in a very alarming rate in India too. Having been deprived of their traditional resource control, the indigenous inhabitants of these affected areas are facing severe social disintegration with the potential for complete cultural and even biological extinction in some instances. We see that forced displacement renders the tribal population with a death of their social being and reduces them to what Giorgio Agamben would call as the bare life. So, Agamben's concept of bare life, a life that is stripped of political rights, any social aspects, and that is existing solely in its biological aspect at the mercy of the larger global happenings. That is the bare life that Agamben describes, and it can be directly applied to describe the condition of the displaced tribal population. The nascent state of Jharkhand is facing considerable difficulties despite the initial optimistic projections of its development. The Jharkhand movement for statehood was fundamentally a movement for cultural reconstruction, aspiring to create a state that embodies the ideals of a tribal society. So, Jharkhand, when it separated from Bihar, it was originally meant to be shaped through the fundamentally through or in terms of the tribal values of self-reliance, dignity, social equity and fairness, economic cooperation and symmetrical access to resources, consensual democracy, religious tolerance, cultural coexistence, a robust work ethic and collective joy. But all these things fall apart when external schemes start interfering. The whole Jharkhand movement is undone. It has been annulled, right, because the state has not been able to achieve the principles on which it was made, right, although the optimistic projections of its development is a part of our popular consciousness. So, the core problem consistent with other tribal or indigenous regions lies in the economic, social as well as the cultural disposition that results from developmental policies which amount to internal colonialism. So, the tribal people are kind of incarcerated from all directions and they are delimited and suppressed from all directions by different development projects that are being endorsed within the nation state and also by some transnational projects that are receiving monetary support from larger global funds. So, this has led to pervasive poverty, malnutrition, illiteracy, unemployment and an overall decline in self-esteem among the people of Jharkhand and by extension on the Adivasi population at large. So, to conclude, globalization presents a complex duality for the Indian tribes. While potentially offering cultural exchange and economic opportunities, it predominantly manifests as a force that leads to, that drives marginalization, resource exploitation and cultural erosion, worsening the existing vulnerabilities that are stemming among the tribes from causes such as historical disposition, and all these factors actually hinder tribal integration with the rest of the non-tribal culture on equitable terms. So, when a population is dispossessed, constantly displaced, uprooted from their areas, they are marginalized, their resources are exploited, they cannot be smoothly integrated with the rest of the national culture and they cannot the interface of the tribals with the non-tribals cannot happen on equitable fair terms. So, these are some of the things that we need to consider and take back home. We should think of how the tribes are being seriously affected by the different upshots that globalization leaves in its trail. So, with this we come to the end of our lecture here today, and let us meet with a new topic and another round of discussions in our next lecture. Thank you.